Dear gracious God in heaven, we thank you again as we come before you on this Sabbath day. We thank you for the blessings, for the mercy, for the opportunity to come together as we are with all of our Oceania family. It's such a blessing that we would never have been able to easily do in person. So it's such a blessing to be able to do this on a regular basis. We ask now that as we come together, that you'll please help your Holy Spirit to work in our hearts and minds, that you will help us to see the things that we're going through, in particular in the light of the current issues that we are facing with the current test. And I ask for a blessing, not just on the hearers, but on me, if you can help me to say the right words and present in a way that will be a blessing to others. And I just thank you again for your mercy and your goodness. And I pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So yes, as I was saying, Elder Tess has done numerous presentations really that discuss these topics, and she's been developing these themes over the last few years. And in particular, what I'm looking at today touches on some presentations that were done earlier in this year in Brazil, as well as going back to earlier presentations from March in 2021. But I'm sure there's other talks that are also relevant. So what I want to cover today, just to give you a brief outline, is I want to look at the line of Eden to Eden again, but in a condensed version. And then I want to take a look at heaven before sin and the government of God. I'd like us to get a deeper understanding of that, and then a little bit of a look at Eden before sin and compare the two types of government that were proposed, God's government and then Lucifer's alternative, and of course the consequences of sin and where that sort of has left us today, given where we are on that line. So it's interesting this morning actually that Rachel's talk showed some relevance, or the relevance of male activist movement and the impact on culture and what that's having in regard, the effect that's having on, in particular, on gender equality. And so some of what I'm covering today is definitely relevant to what Rachel was talking about. In particular, things like she was talking about Gamergate, obviously, but what I wanted to look at is how it really stems from the beginning, and now we're looking at how these male activists are basically wanting to put their freedom as being far more important than any sort of equality of women. And so we can see from what I'm going to present, I think, that how this all started. So that's my prayer anyway. So I'll just write on the board, so we'll just discuss this on the board. I wonder if I can easily I'll just ask some questions in a minute, but for the most part, for the moment, let's just start with this. So this line is representing Eden to Eden. Hopefully you can all see that okay. Sorry about the screens reflecting if I turn them down, I won't be able to see them, so I can't turn the lights on those down. So we've got the Eden to Eden line, and we know that what the purpose of this presentation that Elder Tess did was to show how God's character is to be restored in humanity. And so that's why I've titled it God's Government Restored. And Eden to Eden, we sometimes refer to it as the line of restoration. And we know that it started in heaven, and we know that it finishes in heaven. And just before I get too far in, if there's any problems with my audio, someone just let me know and I can maybe change it. I've made some adjustments. I'm hoping it'll work okay. So we know that the line starts in heaven, it finishes in heaven, and we also know that sin began in heaven and it will be finalized in heaven. And what we have here is when sin went from heaven to this earth. We know it went to Eden, and it's going to restore Eden in the new earth at the end. So what we're looking at is an example. This study was able to open up to us the path we are having to take in order to be restored to that state. And we know that in heaven, when sin began, Lucifer misrepresented God's character and his government. And he set out to make God's government look ugly, and his own government look beautiful. And the consequence of that fall for Lucifer and the fallen angels was to be thrown out of heaven to this earth, to Eden, via aggressive communication, is what Elder Tess called it. And on this earth, Satan began his work to deceive Adam and Eve and to unite the inhabitants of this earth in his warfare against the government of God. So the first achievement in his goal was here, where we have the original sin and the fall of humanity, which began with the sin of Eve. And on a superficial level, I think as Adventists, we've often looked at that as a sin relating to diet, which was extremely superficial. We've come to understand that there was much more involved with that. And it was more of a test of allegiance, a government based on equality that God presented, or one that was based on individual choice and freedom to do whatever it was you felt fit to determine your own course of action. And of course, the consequences or the curse that was resulting from that has given us a lot more detail on that. So we've come to understand the fact that what's actually evolved from that fall was issues around gender. We've seen that it's basically established a developing sexism in the world, and basically patriarchy has been the established issue right from the fall. So the original sin, if you like, was involving all of these issues. So basically what we've got then is we traveled through a smaller, well, we don't know how much time exactly, but we came to the second sin, the second big issue, if you want, for want of a better description. And we know that that was Cain, and we know that that involved worship. Oops, put a little I in there, that'll make it better. So down here, basically, even in this situation, even though we don't make a comparison directly with this, we tend to more go to the third. But here we still see an issue between equality and freedom, because there was a sense where Cain felt he should have the freedom to worship as he chose, as opposed to coming under the government of God and doing what he was supposed to do or what he was told. So he actually put his own preferences ahead of those that were already given by God as the course of action for worship, or the appropriate worship. So then we come up to the third. And the third issue was, again, if you like, it was almost like a fresh start for the earth. We had a start for the earth here. We had another start here because God had to bring the flood to basically eradicate the larger overtaking of the world with sin, and we know that Elder Tess has referred to this in regard to it wasn't just sexual immorality, it was really involving these issues. So it had become so bad that he had to sort of try to start again, because God was limited in what he could do. He was limited in that he had to obey his own laws and he had to follow his own principles, because otherwise he wouldn't be God. So he wasn't to force anybody. He needed to work with what he had. And so therefore, he's been working to bring humanity back from the fall here. And we know that the third issue involved Ham. And with this issue, we saw from Kathy McGraw's presentation, she explained it really well, how because the Bible's been written from a patriarchal perspective, it was written that Ham sinned against his father. But we know now that when you study that deeper and you start to see, he actually sinned against his mother. But because his father owned his mother, it was seen as a sin against his father. So his mother was not really, I don't think we've even got her name. This is basically, they were not considered as relevant to the development of humanity. And so that sin was quite heinous, really, when you think about it. And as a result, Canaan, the offspring from that sin, ended up becoming the line where slavery and racism would begin. So racism, slavery, and of course ownership. Now we already had ownership in that women were owned by men, but what this did was it kind of extended that ownership. It went from just owning women to now owning some people, other people who were basically seen as a lower class, who were there to serve them. So you had the ruling class, which was primarily the males, who had the power to have both as many wives as they chose, concubines, women in their service for their use, and also slaves who became a part of that whole system. So these were the first three sins that led to that God was eventually aiming to reverse the course of these problems with humanity. And I'll just throw in the fact that what you had really was culture. I'll put that in because obviously that's been a very key issue, and it does come up again throughout this discussion in some of the quotes. You'll see, even though the word doesn't come up as such, we can clearly see that it was the culture in heaven that Lucifer rebelled against, and he started to form his own culture, his own ideas of government, and he started to impact the culture that because of the fall, that started to have its consequences. And we know that the curse was a prophetic curse. It was a prophetic consequence, if you will, to what would happen as a result of these sins. Now, there's a bunch of history here that Elder Tess goes into and explains in more detail, and I certainly encourage you to look at those again if you need to. But we know that when we come to modern Israel and we look at, there was the 1260 years of darkness, and we know that that brought us at the end of that up to the time of the end, which was in 98, which I'm going to end up having some interesting diagrams there in a minute, but anyway, I don't know how well that'll work. So we've got, in 1798, the restoration process began in earnest. I mean, God was working with humanity all through, but he had to wait until technology and various things were developed through time in order to be able to really start to have an impact on changing the culture on this earth. And we know that in 1863, we can see here that there was, in the United States, a civil war, and it was all over the issue of slavery and racism. And this obviously came from, this was the failure, and this was where God's people were able to determine that this was wrong. And we saw Ellen White condemning slavery, even though we know that Abraham had slaves. We know biblically slavery could be upheld, and in fact, during the Civil War, the South would use the Bible as an excuse, as a justification, and reasonably so, you could say, if you were taking a literal perspective, they could actually justify having slaves. And Ellen White said, no, that's wrong. And she didn't really have any recourse to do that other than the fact that she had developed a closer contact with God, I guess, and God was able to reveal these things to her so that she was able to see that this was actually wrong and against God's true character. So that was the first step backwards, if you like, or step back towards restoration. And then we had the issue of, in 1888, of the Sunday law issue. And this was a worship issue. And God's Sabbath was recognized again as being the true day of worship. And we know that there was both internal and external events. Here there was internal, external events as well, but primarily internal and external events here. And we, as God's people, we passed that test of recognizing God's day of worship. And then we come to our time of the end, because this was the alpha of modern Israel, and now we're into the omega of modern Israel. And our time of the end began in 1989, as everybody here I'm sure is aware. And our test now is which one? Obviously it's this one, because we've done the other two and we're going backwards. We started here and we have to finish here in order to complete this restoration process. And it's God's people in particular that really have to come to a much clearer understanding and a better understanding of what God's true character and God's government is really like. And I think for many of us, perhaps that's been a challenge as we've gone through this process, because we thought we saw, I suppose, a pretty version, for want of a better way to say it, of patriarchy. In other words, Ellen White in her day painted kind of a nice version of patriarchy. She did stand up for some things in her day, but it wasn't her test. And that's why she didn't really have the same disdain for sexism and patriarchy that she did for slavery, because that was their test in that time period. And for us, of course, we have this test here, and we need to see it. As Elder Tess said, Ellen White saw it through a glass darkly, but we need to see it face to face. We need to see it for what it really is in all its ugliness. We can't paint pretty pictures. And even though there you can, there's cases for how it can be oh, but it's good, it's nice. If it's done properly. But the fact is, it's not. There is no nice when the consequence of something is actually opposing God's government and God's whole foundation for the existence of a peaceful and united universe and for eternity. So we have to really come to understand what that is about. So our test for our dispensation are these issues. And we need to see them just like Ellen White saw the ugliness of this problem. We need to come and see the ugliness of this problem, which for many of us is so ingrained because it's the one that we've been infiltrated with, if you like, for over 6,000 years. It's so bound up almost in our DNA, or our genetics, because it's been there from the beginning. It was the original sin. So it was the whole reason that humanity fell, and the consequences of that to the rest of humanity, all living things. And in fact, that's part of what made that issue a problem in the beginning. It wasn't just a simple problem. It was a problem about freedom and equality. It was a case of whether Adam and Eve could have the freedom to choose what they wanted to do, and even if it meant inflicting a terrible outcome on the rest of humanity, the rest of creation, all living creatures would from then have a consequence as a result of them exercising their freedom in a way that which was contrary to God's instructions. So we've been having this consequence go throughout this line, if you like. Now, I think the other thing that we need to really acknowledge is the fact that the effects on women have not just been on women. Anyone who demonstrates anything that is not an apis bull mentality, in other words, it was the patriarchy, the strong male, the image that was worshipped, really. And anyone, whether they were female or whether they were male, who demonstrated what they perceived as feminine qualities, basically led to a discrimination against the LGBTQ community as well. And we know this today in particular because we've seen a lot of the ramifications of that. I think technology has certainly made it a lot clearer for most of us to be able to see the effects, because we've got things like the internet and computers, and we can communicate so readily. The fact that we're able to have these meetings on Zoom, I mean, technology today is vastly different from what was available throughout this part of history. So we can see a lot of times the effects that this is having on these communities that have been discriminated against. And this is a direct result of patriarchy. And so I think, I'm just thinking, that's double checking if I've covered everything that I wanted to cover. So yeah, so what we're looking at really is the consequence of sin here, and just a diagrammatic view of the restoration process. And this is why this is how we have been able to determine what our final test is. And we are in that testing time now. So it's critically important, it's eternally important that we are able to be willing to challenge long-held views and thoughts so that we can be passing this test as we go. And I'm sure God will be bringing up issues for each one of us, depending on where we are and what we're used to as far as our own individual societies and cultures is concerned. So I just want to look at a couple of quotes now. I want to go back and have a little bit of a look at heaven and what it was like before sin. So I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully everyone will be able to see that. Is that showing up? Can everyone, which one's showing? Can you see that screen okay? I think, I'm not sure if you can.
Yes.
No, you can? Oh, good. Excellent. Actually, could I have somebody just read just the yellow parts of this quote for me, please? The highlighted areas.
Sure, can read that, Lynn.
Thank
Before
you.
the entrance of evil, there was peace and joy throughout the universe. All was in perfect harmony with the Creator's will. Love for God was supreme, love for one another impartial. And the yellow one down below as well, Lynn.
Yes, please.
And to Christ equally with the Father, all heaven gave allegiance. Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you very much. So I want to pick up on that word there that's impartial. And I just want to say that, well, actually, before I pick up on that word, I'll just make a little list here of things that we got out of that quote. So love for God, and we had peace, joy, harmony, and we know that there was love for each other. And the word impartially was there. And we saw equality. In other words, Christ was one with God and Christ equally with the Father. It talked about that in that quote. And they were serving God and one another. Oops, there we go. Right. So these points was a description, if you like, of what that was. And I looked up the word impartial, and impartial was interesting because these are things that I think I would have read once without really clicking what that meant. And the dictionary definition said not partial or biased. And the other thing that was interesting was treating or affecting all equally. So really, it's another word for equality. Everyone was treated equally, impartially, without bias. And I thought that was actually really insightful. It's built into the message, yet it's not something we've picked up on over the years, I guess, until it's been brought up by Elder Tess and different things that Elders Parminder and Tess have been teaching. So God's government really focused on equality, and without it, you couldn't really have genuine love. We often say God is love, and of course he is, but obviously that love was specific and equality was a part of that. So from that past quote, I just want to make a quick reference to this quote, which is following on. It just says, the law of love being the foundation of the government of God. So the happiness of all created beings depended upon their perfect accord with its great principles of righteousness. And God desires from all his creatures the service of love, homage that springs from an intelligent appreciation of his character. He takes no pleasure in a forced allegiance. To all he grants freedom of will that they may render him voluntary service. So basically we've got the foundation was the law of love, and we have that there was the great principles of righteousness and voluntary service, freedom of will. So there was freedom. But of course it was under this auspice, or the auspices of God's love, or the foundation, which was the law of love, which was described in terms of equality and impartiality. So looking at equality and freedom, again, looking at a dictionary definition, we can see that the Oxford Dictionary says state of being equal, especially in status, rights and opportunities, and the Cambridge Dictionary, the right of different groups of people to have similar position and receive the same treatment equally between sexes, racial equality. So that's equality, where basically everyone receives the same treatment. Freedom, on the other hand, emphasizes the power or right to act, speak or think as one wants. And the Cambridge Dictionary says the condition or right of being able or allowed to say, think, etc., whatever you want to without being controlled or limited. You can really see that in the light of this message. And one of the things I want to notice is what's the focus of these two things. And I think the focus that stands out to me is equality. The focus is on others. Freedom, the focus is on self. And so I'm hoping that we can start to see what an important part this plays in God's government. And we know that in 1 Corinthians, we've got a really good description of love. And it says in there in 1 Corinthians 13 chapter 13, verses 4 and 5. If anyone wants to open your Bibles, that's fine, but I'll just read that quickly. It says, charity suffereth long and is kind. Charity envieth not. Charity vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil. I'm sure all of those words are familiar to everybody here. And I think now as we're reading those verses through slightly new eyes, hopefully, we can see it's interesting that they say seeketh not her own. There's a feminine emphasis put on that. And I think that these are the subtle things that come through, that these are feminine qualities, but really they're not feminine qualities. They're actually God's qualities. And that, not that God's not feminine, but he's not either. He's not, it's non-gendered. In other words, it should be non-gendered, but we've kind of had that infiltration of the feminine being a loving characteristics and feeling and caring and all of that. So charity vaunteth not itself. Vaunteth means it's not boastful. So love is not boastful. And it's not puffed up or prideful. And it's not selfish or self-seeking. So we can see how this really ties into equality, because this has a focus on others, not on self. Whereas the focus on self tends to be this. So I just want to emphasize that a lot of what I'm discussing, especially given our Adventist mindset, really looks like morals. And I guess it is, but my purpose isn't to highlight the moralistic aspects of these things, even though they're relevant in another context. My purpose is to really try to bring it back to understanding the qualities that exist with these two principles, the principles of equality and the principles of freedom. This is kind of aimed at getting a better understanding of God's government and what it was like and what he is trying to restore in us. And obviously this prophetic message that we have and the prophetic truths that have been coming out, and just basically all the messages we've been given for this time in history, they have basically, they're meant to change us. So from a moral perspective, we hopefully will change as we are able to see these things in a different light, through different glasses, not through the glasses of patriarchy, which is the glasses we've traditionally looked through all these things with. So we know that Philippians talks about, let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem each other better than themselves. Look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. We see this principle of being more aware of others and being sensitive to others, being more mindful of others. And it reminds me of the fact that what we're doing is serving God and one another. And this is the principle of equality. So I think I've covered all of that. And I think also we're all familiar with the golden rule, which is Matthew 7:12, where it quotes basically, therefore all things whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them, for this is the law and the prophets. So we modernize that to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And to me, that's really another demonstration of equality, because obviously you want to be treated as you want to treat other people as you want to be treated yourself, which to me is another definition, or it fits in with the principle of equality. So the other thing I want to address is gender, because obviously when God created Adam and Eve, he created gender. But we know that there was no gender in heaven. So even though it doesn't come out as a part of God's government, I think it is relevant to us to understand there is no gender, because as human beings, we tend to, what we see is all there is. We have genderized heaven, either intentionally or unintentionally. And we know that in Galatians it says there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, and there is neither male nor female. And I just want to have a closer look at those things, because really what that verse says in Galatians 3:28, it obviously says neither male nor female. So I'll just put Galatians 3:28. So there's neither male nor female means no gender. It also says neither bond nor free. So there is no slavery. Can someone tell me what they might think neither Jew nor Greek might mean? If you could just give me a thought about what you see, if you think the same as me. What would you suggest they're talking about there? My first thought was race, but in actual fact, I don't think it is race. Even though it's connected, race was connected to the issue, I think this is another issue. Can someone else maybe tell me what they think this is referring to? Neither Jew nor Greek.
Hi, Lynne.
Yes.
As soon as you were reading it, I was thinking that it was an issue of worship.
Yes.
Sort of slavery.
Yes, exactly. That was my thought too. I thought because really the true worship was Jew. If you weren't, they referred to Greeks, which was really like a general term for non-Jews for their world. That's what existed. And you had the true worship or the false worship. You had God's worship or paganism, which is Greek, Gentile, another term. So really, I believe that was actually referring to worship. And in heaven, it's not that there's no worship, but we know there is only true worship. So you could say no false worship. So there is just one worship. I mean, that's, I think the point is it's united in one worship, true worship. And I just thought it was really interesting that we ended up with the three issues repeated there. It was something that I thought was quite interesting. So we also know that in Matthew 22:30 it says that that there'll be no marriage or given in marriage because we will be as the angels of God in heaven. So we know that in heaven there is no gender, and I'm going to add that to this list because I think for us that's an important thing to remember at this time in history. And there's no gender, no slavery, no false worship. So God's government, I think you could say, was based on love, unselfishness, righteousness, equality, and freedom under the law. In other words, there was freedom in heaven, but it was always under this, it was referred to as the law of liberty because law came first, liberty came second. It's important to be free under that and to have free will. And that's why Satan or Lucifer was able to reject it, because he did have freedom, but he didn't keep that freedom in the constraints of equality. So we know that on earth it was a similar problem. Basically, Satan came down with the intent of forming his own government, forming an opposing government to God, where he could prove the superiority of his way of seeing things, where all beings should have the freedom to govern themselves. And I think that when you start to understand libertarianism, you start to see how this was really what Lucifer was proposing, libertarianism. You know, we shouldn't have rules. Angels are perfectly capable of, you know, they're divine beings. They're perfectly capable of knowing what's right and wrong. They can choose for themselves. And basically, he was really putting forth that libertarian perspective. And he's presented that same thing to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Basically, you can have the freedom. You can know that, you know, you can be as gods. And you don't need to be restricted. It's just, and he basically misrepresented God as lying to them. No, you shall not surely die. And they should have known better. Well, they did know better because they'd been taught. And this was important. God instructed them of all of the implications that would be, would happen should they choose to follow an alternative, if you like. And so in Eden before sin, we saw that man was made in the image and likeness of God, and they had dominion over creation. They were equally given that dominion, freedom under the law of love or impartiality or liberty as well. So there was freedom under that law of impartiality, and there was equality, one flesh. They were made as one flesh. You can't be more equal than one flesh. So there was gender, yes, but it was one flesh. That was the how it was initially created, how they were initially created. And Ellen White actually discusses in The Present Truth that it was the glory of Adam and Eve to obey God's requirements. This was before sin entered the world. They lived in perfect conformity to his will. Not a cloud rested upon their minds. No doubt or uncertainty in regard to their moral obligations. All the strength of their affections was given to their heavenly Father. A beautiful soft light proceeding from God enshrouded the holy pair. And then it just says that God was their teacher and the beauties of nature around them, his lessons were repeated. So it was
Can
a
I have that quote, Lynne?
beautiful scene. Yes, absolutely. That quote is The Present Truth, January 7, 1897, paragraph 1. I'll just write it up here as the short version. Just where's a good spot? Here we go. I'll try here. PRT, and it's January 7, 1897, paragraph 1. So that's that quote there. So Adam and Eve were made in the likeness of God. They had dominion over creation. We've already covered all of that, and they were one flesh. But we can also say they were conforming to God's will. They lived under his government, and they obeyed the love, equality, service, peace, joy, and harmony. They were living under this rule. And when they did, they had no cares, carefree, full service to God, and they were students of God, and they were surrounded by the beauty of nature. And I think you could say there was innocence because they didn't know sin and they didn't know good from evil, if you like, at that point. Well, they did in the sense that they were taught it, as in the consequences, but they didn't know it because they didn't experience it. So the law of love was the foundation of God's government. And basically, the happiness of all the beings around them really depended upon their willingness and their to really commit their freedom to obeying the laws of God. But of course, God takes no pleasure in forced allegiance. So therefore, everyone still had the will to serve them voluntarily, which left open an opportunity for Satan to start to infiltrate with his false stream of information. Excuse me. So basically, Lucifer, who had misused his freedom, set about to corrupt humanity by encouraging them to misuse theirs. So he challenged God's government and he started to make accusations against God. So I'm just having a quick look at my notes. It's really, this established two streams of information right from the beginning. You can see that now that we're looking at these things with different glasses to what we've understood previously, and we can see that sin was the misuse of freedom. Pardon me. It involved pride, self-centeredness, and self-serving, and that's really what represented the freedom that Satan was proposing. He took the focus from others to self, basically, and this appeals sometimes, or if we're not careful, it's easy to fall into that trap, especially after 6,000 years of experiencing that on a regular basis. So he, let's see, what have we got now? So God gave Lucifer the opportunity to show the outcome of his claims. In other words, God had to allow the effects of this government to come to fruition so we could see the effects and the outcome. And the true character of the usurper and his real objectives must be understood by all. Excuse me. So it took time to manifest himself and his wicked works, and Ellen White talks about that in Patriarchs and Prophets, page 42, paragraph 1. And then she goes on to say in paragraph 2 of the same quote, the discord which his own course had caused in heaven, Satan charged upon God's government. Now here we see the switch. In other words, he was the usurper, but he wanted to blame God. What does that sound like? What did we hear this morning that Rachel was talking about? We know that those who are, in fact, the perpetrators will start to paint themselves as the victim. They will blame the in our frequent or in our recent studies, they blame the victim. In this instance, Satan or Lucifer was blaming God. And he said all evil he declared to be the result of divine administration. And so it needed time to sort of unmask the truth of those claims. And that's where we find ourselves today. When you look at that other line, we're right at the end and we're actually seeing that play out. So he reiterated his claim, and this is a quote from Great Controversy 499.2. It says, he reiterated his claim that angels needed no control, but should be left to follow their own will, which would ever guide them right. He denounced the divine statutes as a restriction to their liberty. So liberty, we know, is freedom. He was claiming that God's laws restricted their freedom and declared that it was the purpose to secure the abolition of law. What does that sound like? Small government, not big government. Didn't want more laws, didn't need to have so many laws because they could rule themselves. They could have the freedom to rule themselves. And the quote goes on to say that freed from this restraint, the hosts of heaven might enter upon a more exalted, more glorious state of existence. So this was the picture that Satan or Lucifer portrayed. And he goes on to say that, you know, if they had not been reproved, they would never have been rebelled. It would never have rebelled. So what he's saying is that these laws caused them to rebel. And basically, this is a really good quote in Great Controversy 499.3, where it says that thus stubborn and defiant in their disloyalty, seeking vainly to overthrow the government of God, yet blasphemously claiming to be themselves the innocent victims of oppressive power. So the arch rebel and all his sympathizers were at last banished from heaven. So they were forced out of heaven because they were painting themselves as the victims of an oppressive power. He had basically taken a third of the angels and managed to convince them that his government was a better alternative. So like him, it goes on in 500.1 in Great Controversy, like him they seek to break down the restraints of the law of God and promise men liberty through transgression of its precepts. So this is the lie that he told to Adam and Eve. This is the lie that's been following through history, that we should be able to disobey the laws of God. And it's through doing that that we gain freedom and a higher form of existence, is what Satan's lie is. And they seek sympathy of others in their course of sin. In other words, they want to be seen as the victims and not the perpetrators of that rebelliousness. So they wanted liberty or freedom to do what they wanted and abolish all the laws. They wanted a small government. They didn't want a big government. So they were abusing those freedoms in order to paint themselves as the victims, if you like. So just moving down. Let me just see. I might just open up these quotes here. And well, actually, before I open that up, Great Controversy 500.3 says, by the same misrepresentation of the character of God as he had practiced in heaven, causing him to be regarded as severe and tyrannical, Satan induced man to sin. And having succeeded thus far, he declared that God's unjust restrictions had led to man's fall, as they had led to his own rebellion. And this is really what we're seeing playing out in history, and in particular with the culture wars that are currently underway. And I think it's fair to say that what we've had, really, you could almost say that the whole Great Controversy has been culture wars right from the beginning. It was Satan, Lucifer, was really trying to bring about cultural changes in heaven, and it became two streams of information, but also two cultures. And on the earth, he's done the same sort of thing. So we've got a culture where patriarchy started to rule, and this is why it had to take a form such as patriarchy to do that, because it was like the strong over the weak almost, and that's how it was portrayed. So in order to bring this about, you had to have somebody dominating somebody else. So we know that God actually gave a good example of his love for humanity, which actually really proved Lucifer wrong, and that was by sending his son to die on our behalf. And we know that Elder Tess has spoken about the sin that killed Christ. It was the weight of sin, the extreme agony over what sin had really perpetrated throughout history that brought about his death, not just the physical, abuse that he suffered, but actually the weight of sin and the terribleness of sin. And it was God's love that actually chose to sacrifice himself on our behalf, because God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. And of course, it's all patriarchal language, but we know now we know a bit more what that means, and that love or equality must be the principle of action. And love is the underlying principle of God's government in heaven and on earth, and it must be the foundation of the Christian's character. And this is actually a quote also from Signs of the Times. This alone can make and keep him steadfast, the Christian. This alone can enable him to withstand trial and temptation. So it's as we understand what God's love is and what God's government is in heaven and earth, and it must be that must make up the foundation. So this has to be our foundation. Oops. And yes, you want that quote? No? Sorry, is someone going to say something? Okay.
Just put it down.
Yeah, I'll put it down anyway. Signs of the Times, that was.
No,
And
just asking for the quote.
you were? Okay, yeah, I thought maybe you might be. 1905 and paragraph 11. That's pretty, hold on, where am I? There we go. Let me just make that a little bit more clear, hopefully. So paragraph 11. And so that more or less brings us close to the end. Basically, we saw the rebellion in heaven, the rebellion against God's government. And in order for God to be able to restore the government, he has to bring us through that process of Eden to Eden. We have to pass those tests, and we have come to the conclusion of the great controversy, if you like, on this earth. We're at that concluding stages where the first sin, we now have to have that as our final test. And so we see that the importance of gender equality, when we start to look at this whole picture, we can sort of start to see it a little bit more clearly, I hope. So I just want to ask if anyone's got any comments or questions. Actually, one thing I will say just before we close, a thought that I had through all of this, because sometimes freedom sounds so beautiful, as Elder Tessa said, when you look at the libertarian portrayal of freedom, it sounds quite lovely if you only looking at the surface. And it just reminded me of the quote in Matthew 24, where it says, you know, if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. And who'd have thought that a test at this end time would be something like this? And we know from our lines, from how the message is developed, we know that this test is a critical test. We can see why this test is the final test. And we are being tested right now because this is where we are now, just here. So we need to really be able to be more aware. So if anyone has any comments or questions, that would be good. And then we'll close in prayer. And if you don't, that's fine too.
You must have
Raymond,
done a very good job. So we have no questions. Thank you.
I'll take that as the case. Thank you, Josephine. I see, Raymond, you had your hand up. I don't know. Oh, that's now. So I haven't missed it too long. Anyway. Yep. Did you want to say something, Raymond? Sorry.
Yeah, I just had a question. When I remember when Elder Tess was going over this recently, I can't remember if she sort of mentioned it explicitly or if it was just something that came to mind, but that choice between freedom and equality, you know, the choice that Adam and Eve made in Eden didn't just affect them, it affected the animals
Yes.
as well. And so
yes.
I'm just wondering, does our sort of approach to, you know, plant-based diet and veganism and whatnot, does that play into that? I was visiting my brother in April, and we were just talking about it, and he sort of pointed out something that had never occurred to me before. So, like, you know, as good Seventh-day Adventists, we weren't super strict. We were vegetarian, not vegan. But he's like, the dairy and poultry industries, when you think about it, only affect the female of all those animal species. I'd never considered that before. I was like, wow, even those choices are sexist. So is that part of that Eden to Eden thing as well?
That's actually a really good point. And I think that it's fair to say we know that Adam and Eve were instructed that the result of sin would impact all creatures. It imposed death and suffering on all creatures, all living creatures. So I think it's fair to say that that is all part and parcel of that whole original sin situation. And yeah, it's an interesting thing. And of course, it's the females that breed, if you like. So therefore, it kind of is understandable how they have been, even female animals have then been brought into that web, if you like, by default. And yeah, I think it's a tone. I mean, it's an attitude of misrepresenting how the intention of God was originally for the sake of having dominion over all of creation. So they were given dominion, but they weren't given dominion in the context of ownership or overbearing headship, let's say, for want of a better description. And as we look at how animals are treated, I think often we see the worst of humanity. And I suppose we do know, though, that the health message has also been for our benefit from the point of view, not just maybe counteracting that concept of cruelty and inequality that exists for animals. I mean, it also was for our health, because we knew that at the end times that how things have developed was going to impact animals and the food chain, even to some extent probably plants, but at least we had a better chance by having a vegan diet. So that was I guess the way the health message was given. But now that we can see a deeper underlying principle, I think it's reasonable to say, yeah, okay, so you can see how that sin has actually played out and impacted all creatures on the earth in a way that was never God's intention. So I think that's reasonable. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, no, it does. Thank you so much.
That's okay. Thanks for asking. So I don't know if there's any other comments or questions.
Can I just say something?
Yes, please.
In heaven, before sin, the foundation of God's running his government is the power of choice. So did he create two cultures of equality over freedom and freedom over equality, and then allow us to make a choice, or the creatures to make their own choice of which culture to run on? And because Satan choose freedom over equality, there was a separation between the angel, and there was a war happened, and they got kicked out. Mm-hmm. And again, Satan came to Eden and did the same thing, and allowed the couples to make a choice for themselves, and they choose freedoms over equality, and we have 6,000 years of consequences of that choice. So was God the one that created two cultures in heaven?
Okay. I guess I can only share my thoughts on that. And the thoughts that come to my mind are probably twofold. One is, I'll say first of all, that I don't believe there was existing that culture in heaven that was the wrong culture. The potential was there, because if you actually look at good, you can't really have good without evil, if you know what I mean. It's not that evil existed, but the potential for evil existed. But because there was no sin in heaven, that wasn't exercised. But in order for freedom to exist, there had to be the potential to make a different choice. So there's also, I believe, and I don't remember where that quote is, but in the Bible somewhere there's a quote in the Old Testament which talks about God says he takes responsibility for the existence of evil, because at one level, to create good, the potential for evil has to exist. And I think that was the point, not that that's the full quote, but that's the implication of the quote. So God takes responsibility, even though I don't believe the cultures existed and then Satan chose that culture. I think there was no iniquity until sin was found in him. So it wasn't like it was there and everybody could say, oh, yeah, no, I think I like this one, not that one. It was a case of he started to exercise his will or his freedom in a wrong way, which, as we know, starts to develop and strengthen. So what we exercise, and we've seen this in some of the talks we've had recently about neural pathways and things like that, we've seen that as we practice something, even our thoughts, they become stronger, and that path becomes stronger and becomes more ingrained. And I think that what happened, from what I can kind of think, and as I say, it's really only what I'm thinking, is that the potential was there, but not the culture. So the culture wasn't created by God. The good culture was created, but in order to have the good culture, the correct culture, the potential for the opposite was always there. Otherwise, there would have been no choice for anyone on an individual basis. But I don't think they had it in front of their eyes, if you like, or in front of, I don't think it was presented to them as an alternative. Oh, you can do this, or you can go and do this. I think it was more the case of it was only as iniquity was found in Lucifer that seed of sin started to grow. He planted that, and that grew into the culture that he created, because as he pursued that course, it grew and developed. Does that make any sense, Molly?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
What I'm thinking is that Lucifer was at the throne and he could see the law of God. And he knows what sin is all about and the penalty and consequences of that choice.
Yeah, I think, in order, he would have, I guess, there would have been some recognition of the fact that by disobeying God, or by choosing to oppose the government of God, he was treading on dangerous ground. And I believe Ellen White talks about how he actually did realize his mistake at one point, and he realized the error that he had made, but he'd gone too far, and consequently he was not able to be rehabilitated or taken back, because his mind had become so corrupted by the course of action that he had taken. So I don't know. I mean, even when you're told something, and I don't know if this is the way it was, but even when you're a little child and you're told, well, look, don't touch the stove because it's hot and you'll burn yourself. You don't know what that feels like, really. You know that you're going to hurt yourself, maybe, but you don't fully appreciate until you've touched it yourself, and you go, okay, now I see. And maybe there was an element of that where it was like, instead of just believing God and accepting what God had said, there was this element of rebellion, a seed of rebellion that started to sprout, where, well, I want to see for myself. Is this true or isn't it? So, yeah, I don't think it would have been really demonstrated to complete fruition. And in actual fact, it wasn't, because that's what this great controversy is about, isn't it? It's actually to show the ramifications of Satan's government. In other words, it's to really allow everyone to see the full consequences of sin, for the whole universe to see the full consequences of sin, so that sin can be finally eradicated at the end, because it wasn't evident, the full ramifications. It was said, this is the best way, but it wasn't necessarily, the full consequences weren't really fully appreciated until it was acted out and taken to its eventual end and conclusion. So I don't know if that helps. That's okay. Thank you for your question. So I think that brings us to a conclusion for this morning, and I just want to thank everybody for listening and for participating when required. Thank you for that. And if we can have a kneel in prayer, if we can kneel to pray, that'd be great, or bow your heads, depending. So we'll just have a prayer to close. Thank you. Dear God in heaven, again, we just thank you. We come with thanks and appreciation for all your mercy, your watch care, your just graciousness toward each one of us. You work with each one of us in a personal way, often, as well as with us as a collective. You are showing us through external events the course of the ramifications of Satan's government. And we can start to see how, even as a church, there has been a time where we were caught up in a lot of that false thinking without even really fully realizing what we were caught up in. And we just thank you for the messages that have brought us out, that have shown us, given us a glimpse more of your character. We pray now that as we continue on with our Sabbath day, that you will continue to work in our hearts and minds, that you will make the choice we have between freedom and equality, or equality and freedom, that you'll just help us to see how since the beginning, since the original sin, the fall of humanity has really brought about all the evil in the world. And it was that original sin which involved oppression, which involved sexism and the system of patriarchy and headship to actually control the world and all its resources, that has really brought about all the evil in this world, all the consequences. We ask for a clearer insight. We pray that you will make it a part of our character to have your character. We ask for your character to be imbued in us. Help us to live by that. And again, we just ask for your blessing on each one. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.